In the Turkana Basin of northern Kenya, more than 3.3 million years ago, on the shores of a lake that no longer exists, someone, or something, since we're still not entirely sure who, picked up two rocks and struck one against the other. There was no ceremony to it, no design. Whoever did it wasn't trying to invent a weapon. They were probably trying to get at something, the marrow locked inside a bone, the meat clinging to a carcass their teeth couldn't manage on their own. What broke off that first strike was a sharp-edged flake, thin enough to cut. Archaeologists found the evidence at a site called Lomekwi 3, alongside cut-marked animal bone, and it may predate our own genus entirely. It might not have been Homo at all. It might have been Australopithecus, reaching for a tool the way a chimpanzee reaches for a stick, except this reach left something durable enough to survive 3 million years. Nobody in that moment was building a weapon. They were building a way to eat. And yet that one unremarkable strike, repeated and refined by creature after creature for the next 3 million years, eventually became the foundation of every spear point, arrowhead, and hand axe our species would ever swing, throw, or hurl. Stone was our primary weapon-making material for more than 99% of the entire archaeological record of tool use, longer than fire, longer than language as we know it, longer than almost anything else we've ever done consistently. So how did a rock picked up to crack a bone become a weapon capable of bringing down a mammoth? The answer runs through a technique for reading how rock breaks, a discovery that heating stone can sharpen it, an adhesive strong enough to survive a spear's impact, and a slow migration of knowledge that carried the same basic idea out of Africa and across 3 continents. Start with the physics, because it explains everything that follows. Certain rocks, flint, chert, obsidian, quartzite, don't crumble when struck. They break in a specific, predictable pattern called a conchoidal fracture, the same kind of curved break you'd see in a chipped piece of glass. That predictability is the entire secret. A toolmaker who understood how a particular stone would fracture could strike it with a genuine expectation of what shape would result, rather than hoping for something usable. Everything from a crude Oldowan flake to a needle-fine arrowhead depends on that same physical property, just applied with steadily increasing control. For a long stretch of prehistory, that control barely needed to exist. The earliest stone tools, Oldowan technology, were simple flakes struck off a core with a single blow, and they weren't weapons in any dramatic sense. They were butchery tools for cutting meat, scraping hides, breaking bone for marrow. Ordinary, unglamorous, and essential. That changed gradually, starting around 1.76 million years ago, with a tradition called Acheulean technology, most associated with Homo erectus. Acheulean toolmakers weren't just knocking off flakes anymore. They shaped a stone symmetrically on both faces, striking it again and again until it resembled a teardrop pictured before the first blow ever landed. Making a hand axe required imagining the finished shape in advance. Forward-planning archaeologists can actually trace in the pattern of strikes left behind. The next real leap came between roughly 400,000 and 300,000 years ago with a method called the Levallois technique. Instead of shaping the whole tool strike by strike, a toolmaker now shaped the entire core in advance, so one final, precise blow would pop off a flake of a predetermined size and shape, the ancient equivalent of front-loading all your work before the moment that actually mattered. None of this made a true weapon on its own, though. A sharp point, however well made, is still just a hand tool until it's attached to something that can be thrown or thrust with force. That leap came with hafting, binding a finished stone point to a wooden shaft. And it's the step that actually turned a cutting tool into a weapon in the modern sense. Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens solved this with engineered adhesives made from birch tar, pine resin, and beeswax. Birch tar in particular is a genuinely impressive feat of chemistry. Producing it means heating birch bark in a low oxygen environment within a narrow temperature window, because too much heat or too much air and the tar simply burns away instead of forming. Someone had to recognize a usable adhesive when it appeared and know how to reproduce it on purpose, and that knowledge had to be taught, hand to hand, for it to survive. Even the stone itself could be improved before a single strike was made. In South Africa, by around 160,000 years ago, toolmakers were intentionally heat-treating silkrete before knapping it, a process that alters the stone's internal structure and makes it easier to flake with real precision. Someone had identified that a controlled change in a material's properties improved the outcome and applied that change deliberately, before use, generation after generation. From there, the refinements kept compounding. Toolmakers developed developed pressure flaking, pressing a pointed tool of bone or antler against a stone edge to pop off small, precise flakes instead of striking blows. The technique responsible for the fine symmetry and delicate edges of the most sophisticated points ever produced. By the Upper Paleolithic, stone weapon technology had branched into an entire toolkit: standardized blades, small, precise microliths, spear throwers that added leverage and range to a human arm, and eventually the bow, a weapon capable of striking from a distance no thrown spear could match. This technology didn't stay put. As Homo erectus spread out of Africa and across Asia and Europe over hundreds of thousands of years, they carried Acheulean toolmaking with them, and the results raise real questions. Hand axes found on different continents, made by groups separated by vast stretches of distance and time, sometimes look remarkably similar. Similar enough that archaeologists still debate whether that reflects shared ancestry, migration, or independent groups arriving at the same physical solution on their own. Good toolmaking stone itself also move. Archaeologists have traced raw material and finished tools back to sources hundreds of kilometers away, evidence of trade networks, seasonal migration, or wider social contact between groups who otherwise left no other trace of ever meeting. The story doesn't move in a single straight line either. Wooden throwing spears found at a site called Schöningen, finely balanced and aerodynamic, are roughly 300,000 years old. Proof that sophisticated weapons existed made entirely of wood with no stone involved at all, likely predating widespread stone-tipped weapons by a considerable margin. Wood simply doesn't survive the way stone does. It rots, burns, and decomposes within decades rather than millennia. Our picture of prehistoric weaponry is almost certainly skewed toward stone for the same reason we know so much about it now. Stone is what happened to last. What all of this eventually bought our ancestors was reach. Better points and better hafting meant hunters could bring down prey that would have been far too dangerous to approach with bare hands, and that reshaped how groups hunted together. Ambush tactics, driving animals toward a kill zone, coordinated throwing and thrusting by several hunters instead of one. Better nutrition followed, and so, plausibly, did the kind of complex teaching, planning, and imitation that toolmaking itself demanded, skills that had to pass from experienced hands to inexperienced ones long before anyone could write any of it down. Whether that specific chain of cause and effect is what actually pushed human cognition forward is still one of the most debated questions in paleoanthropology. Toolmaking is only one thread among many proposed explanations, alongside cooking, language, and long childhoods, and honestly, we don't know which came first. What we do know is that stone refused to disappear even after something better arrived. Long after early metalworking began, communities kept flaking and repairing stone tools for thousands of years. Since a chipped edge could simply be reflaked rather than thrown away, and no furnace or ore supply was needed to keep using it, metal eventually won on versatility and durability, but the handoff was slow and uneven, taking centuries to complete in some regions. Looking back across the whole arc, from a single flake struck off a rock beside an ancient lake to a fletched arrow loosed from a bow tens of thousands of years later, this is really a story about accumulation. About knowledge surviving only because someone bothered to teach it to someone else. Strike after strike, generation after generation, for 3 million years. Nobody at Lomekwi was trying to invent a weapon. They were trying to get through a piece of bone to the marrow inside. Everything after that first strike, every hand axe, every heat-treated point, every drop of birch tar boiled at exactly the right temperature, is just that same ordinary hunger for a better edge, carried forward by hands that kept teaching other hands for longer than almost anything else we've ever done.